For over 40 years, a secret organisation spied on British citizens. If you supported women's rights or wanted to save the planet, you were a target.
I want to stop corporations asset stripping this planet. I want to stop the government asset stripping the population, and I want a better, fairer, more just world.
If you opposed cruelty to animals or racism, then you were a target.
I knew my telephone was tapped, and I suspected other forms of surveillance. But I had no idea of the sheer extent of this.
The organisation infiltrated over 1,000 groups. To achieve this, they created new personas by stealing the identities of dead children.
I was officially sanctioned to resurrect somebody who died.
They used these new personalities to start relationships with women.
He was very, very involved in my family. We lived together in Nottingham and we went everywhere together for 18 months.
They even used their identities to have sex with women.
Sat down watching TV together. I turned to him and he just sort of lunged and just kissed me, and he said nothing, had no sort of indication or anything. That's just what he did.
In some cases, they even had children.
Bob was there throughout the pregnancy. He went to appointments with me, and he was there when I went into labour. And he held our son as soon as he was born.
Then, once they had what they wanted, they abandoned them and vanished without trace.
And then he left. I remember watching him walk down the path, got in his van, and that's the last I saw of him.
The women wouldn't find out the truth until decades later. The men were in fact undercover police officers who were infiltrating completely lawful left-wing groups.
There was no anti-racist, anti-fascist demonstration in London from September 1993 to September 1997 that I can recall that I wasn't involved in.
One of the most egregious and nasty aspects of this undercover policing was infiltrating the Stephen Lawrence campaign, the black teenager murdered by white racists. And the police, instead of targeting and tracking down and prosecuting those white racists at the time, infiltrate the family's campaign to get justice for their murdered son. Now, this is outrageous. It's, for me, one of the worst examples of undercover policing that was politically discriminatory and completely unjustified.
We as a family had to go through all this, and still there's more to come out.
It's utterly disgusting, but not surprising. They carried out these spying operations so that they could disrupt and sabotage the campaigns and give them advance warning. This is what the Stephen Lawrence campaign is discussing. This is what XY campaign is discussing. They were illegal, these infiltrations, without any doubt.
Allegations made in Parliament claim that the undercover police weren't just passively observing their targets, they were encouraging them to break the law.
Now, the latest allegations would beg the question: has another undercover police officer crossed the line into acting as an agent provocateur? And how many other police spies have been encouraging protesters to commit crimes?
Rather than taking immediate action, the government ordered an inquiry. But it was to be held in secret, and the identities of 140 undercover spies were hidden. The women decided it was time to fight back.
I'm one of 8 women who are bringing a case in the UK right now against the Metropolitan Police for assault and deceit and abuse of our human rights.
Stop! We'd like to talk to you about your infiltration of London Greenpeace and your abuse of the female campaigners. What are you ashamed of?
Some women have even traced the undercover officers and are intent on exposing what they did.
I've come up to Peterborough to put leaflets round just to tell people what he did, and basically that he's still a Conservative councillor.
Many of the spy cops, just like the British establishment, still deny the accusations made against them by the women.
They believed, and probably still believe, that if you hold certain ideals and ideas, then you ought to be spied on. And that, it's straight out of George Orwell, it's straight out of 20th century totalitarianism. The British have never been caught out on it until now, but they're doing exactly the same sort of thing.
This is one of the biggest scandals in British history, and the legal and moral implications cannot be understated. But the inquiry is due to last 7 years, lengthening the abuse that the victims have to endure.
Had I known that he'd been an undercover police officer at the time, it would have had a devastating effect on me, and I would have regarded it as rape. He was wearing a mask. I didn't know who he was. I wouldn't have consented to have sex with this man, and so in that sense, it's non-consensual. How can you have, it's state-sanctioned rape.
By the beginning of the 21st century, the threat of climate change was becoming very real, with more and more people protesting and demanding urgent action to avert a global catastrophe.
The stuff that we were saying back then, what was going to happen, is now very, very real, and it's terrifying. And we were trying to shut down coal-fired power stations and stop them from doing what they're doing. Yes, we were a threat to the status quo, because the status quo is killing us.
This opposition to the destruction of the planet made Green protesters a concern to the establishment because they challenged the status quo. One police officer was given the task of infiltrating a small group of eco-activists in Nottingham. He went on to deceive more than 10 activist women into sexual relationships, and became one of the most notorious of the spy cops. But when his real identity was exposed, it would reveal the activities of the whole secret network.
I have to say anything to may harm the defence if you do mention when questioning something that relates to land report.
This is Ratcliffe-on-Soar coal-fired power station. So the big fat ones you see are cooling towers putting out the steam that comes out from it, but the large one is the chimney. That's the smoke from burning coal. That's one of the largest point sources of carbon in the country. And people were going to shut down the plant, and then when the chimney was cool, get up there and climb up with enough provisions to stay there for a week, and then drop a banner that would have a rolling count of how many tonnes of carbon had been saved because this place wasn't in action anymore. So we came together, there was 114 of us planning to come in and shut this down.
The night before the protest at Ratcliffe Power Station, 114 activists met up at a local school in Nottingham. But as they made their final preparations, the police moved in and arrested them all.
All under arrest on suspicion of being involved in a conspiracy to commit aggravated trespass.
The police had been planning this operation for months, and they were so pleased with the operation's success that they released a video taken on the night. Unwittingly, it featured one of their own spy cops, Mark Kennedy, known as Mark Stone. One of the women he had a relationship with was Sarah.
He was just the driver. I mean, he was kind of helping them, and he was their friend, and so I was getting a ride in his truck. That was kind of the beginning of meeting him. It's not like he's incredibly handsome, it was more that he was so helpful, and he was always eager to make sure he was always kind of like mothery, making sure everyone was doing okay, and everyone else was really stressed, and he was always kind of like goofy and like trying to make sure everybody was taken care of.
These officers weren't just blokes that they kind of fancied and had a relationship with. These were men who were fully briefed on these women as their targets, had their full medical history, their full life history. They had 24-hour backup to be the perfect boyfriend. To be the love of their life.
I would say he definitely was seducing me, yeah. Because I remember being kind of taken aback, like, wow, this guy's paying a lot of attention, you know. I definitely had never had someone pay that kind of attention to me before. So it was startling. I remember thinking, like, do I like this guy? I don't know. But then just all the attention just kind of like, at some point you just like cave into it because it was like, you weren't used to it. Part of why I was so impressed with him was like he was part of these huge projects that I just felt like, who is this person that gets to spend he dedicates his life to these struggles? I mean, like, that was part of my big romance with him, was just like his passion and his generosity to do those things. You know, I didn't know he was being paid. So.
That's it, we've been the motherfucking 69ers.
You know, we were all born in 1969, so we call it the 69ers party. Me and Mark did an awful lot for the organisation for that. We kind of instigated it. We thought we'd get different ones of the 69ers to sing different songs. I picked White Riot by The Clash. Mark did Folsom Prison Blues, which on the night he dedicated to the anarchist Black Cross. The first concrete suspicion, Mark's partner, I spoke to her on the phone, and she'd been on holiday with Mark in Italy. She'd found a passport in the name Mark Kennedy. You know, it felt unlikely. It felt unlikely that he would be a police officer. You know, we thought, like, he's been a mate for 7 years. Like, you know, they don't leave them in the field for 7 years. He lives with us. You know, he's not away that often. And it's only looking back, actually, you figured that he was away a lot because he was in touch so much. You know, he'd be always texting, calling, Facebook and whatever. He actually felt present even when he was absent a lot. Mark was a very sociable and gregarious man and a big traveller, so he should have had enormous amounts of Facebook friends. He had 90. The weird thing was I knew them as well, and that's the weird thing, because you can have, you know, you ask the closest people to you, go and look at their Facebook, it's full of people you've never heard of. It's a strange thing about it. Everybody's network is different to everyone else's, and so that one was suspicious. That was when we thought, this actually does look like somebody's fake life. We found the address where he lives with his wife in Ireland, found a phone number for that, rang up, and he answered, and we wanted him to explain. He said, "What do you think you know?" And we said, "We're not talking about it on the phone." He rang back a couple of hours later and said he was coming over. He said, I land at 1, so I'll be with you about 2. We checked, there was no flight from any Irish airport to any UK airport that landed at anything like that time. That means he must have arrived earlier and talked to somebody else before coming to see us. We knew that he'd been a police officer. We knew he'd been a police officer until very recently, that he had spent years fucking us over. We knew that this was almost certainly the last time we were ever going to see him. We knew that he was still lying. He had lied and lied and lied. And then when we said, "We know you just lied, tell the truth this time," because that wasn't true, and he just lied and lied again. It was insulting, you know, what he was trying to get us to believe. And so one of the others just interjected and just said, "And when did you join the police?" Now, Mark was sat here and he looked at the ceiling and did this big exhalation and just went, "You can't ask these questions." Which was a huge moment of relief. That's a confession. We weren't accusing an activist comrade. That guy was a cop.
Until she received a phone call from a fellow activist, Sarah thought that the man she met and fell in love with in 2005 was called Mark Stone.
When I found out about Mark, it was just like, that's some weird ass shit I don't even want to think about. And I was so not okay. I was just like in shock. There's a lot of anger. I was getting really upset. You're just mad, you know, and little things will just upset me and my upset goes really big. And that's not who I am, but because I didn't deal with this at the time, it's like now I'm starting to deal with it, and it's how many years later? I mean, I ended my relationship with him in 2006, and it's like there's all this anger. And it's not just at Mark, it's at the cops.
But Sarah wasn't the only woman who got a phone call. Whilst working as an undercover police officer, Mark Kennedy had relationships with as many as 10 women.
I basically got a call saying, you know, we have proof Mark was an undercover police officer. We don't want you to find out from the internet. We're going public at 2 o'clock today. This is kind of a courtesy call to make sure you don't get blindsided by this. It was devastating. And then it kind of all came crashing in, and it just kept crashing in. And to an extent, it's kind of never stopped because, you know, when something kind of life-changing and traumatic happens, one of the most important things is getting answers and understanding it. And that process of getting answers and understanding it has taken so long, and it's just kept getting bigger and bigger. So in the beginning, it was just this personal betrayal. Mark lied to me. And then you start to realise, well, it wasn't just Mark that was lying to me. Mark was working for somebody who sent him in there, and there's this whole like back room that I know nothing about. So then there's just this constant looking for answers, and then you find out that it wasn't just Mark that was lying to me. This has been going on for 50 years, and actually I knew 6, 7, 8 different people who were all lying to me about who they were, and it just keeps getting bigger. And those questions, I mean, even now, like I have many questions remain, that even with all the information that I've got, there's stuff that we don't know.
The exposure of Mark Kennedy as an undercover police officer led to the collapse of the trial against the Ratcliffe Power Station protesters, with Kennedy offering to speak as a witness for the defence. In an attempt to distance themselves from Kennedy, the police claimed that he had developed sympathies for the activists and gone rogue, but the claim that he had gone rogue was soon to be challenged by a whistleblower. Peter Francis knew the truth about Kennedy's deployment because, like Kennedy, he was an undercover spy cop.
Well, a normal day for an undercover police officer pretending to be an activist is I lived an activist life for how many days a week it was, and invariably I lived an activist life between 5 to 6 days a week, which meant I woke up in my undercover flat, I went to work doing undercover work, and whenever my activists did anything, I was with them. So in the evenings when we got together, we might just get together socially, or we might get together to go on demonstrations, we might do leafleting, we might do a whole multitude of things, but basically I lived being an activist, and really that was my role for 5 to 6 days a week.
The one thing Francis was sure of is that Kennedy was not acting as a rogue agent. He knew that Kennedy had a considerable organisation behind him.
The police and the hierarchy turned on Mark Kennedy and tried to paint him as being rogue, and I felt that it was my duty, moral obligation to actually not necessarily support him, but actually just say that what is actually being said against him is wrong. He wasn't rogue, this was a unit.
If Kennedy was part of a unit, then how many other undercover officers were there? How many other women had been deceived into relationships? What were their motives? Who were they working for? And how long had this been going on? To start to get answers to those questions, we have to go back 45 years to 1968.
Vietnam was the central obsession, not just for me, but for our generation, because here you saw images of bombings, daily bombings, the tonnage of bombs being dropped on that country, images of young men and women and children being drenched with napalm, i.e. chemical warfare. And so those horrors moved us to do something about it, not just sit and write about it, but actually to go out onto the streets and see how indirectly we could help the Vietnamese.
London. It started as an anti-Vietnam War demonstration in Trafalgar Square. About 10,000 gathered.
In 1968, Tariq Ali and Vanessa Redgrave organised a march to the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square in London.
We hadn't expected so many people.
Over 10,000 people turned up, far more than the police were expecting. Taken unawares, the police weren't able to control the march without resorting to violence.
They had mounted police, they charged the demonstration. Women being carried by the cops in a sort of pretty disgusting way, to insult them. Young people being beaten up. And this demonstration shocked the country.
I was at Grosvenor Square, and the only violence I ever witnessed was by the police. And it was vicious, absolutely vicious. I saw a young black man being beaten, he was covered in blood. I saw a woman being beaten between the legs in Grosvenor Square. These are things that you never forget.
May 1968, and it's the Grosvenor Square anti-Vietnam War demonstration, which the police completely lose control of, and Conrad Dixon, who's a senior officer in the Met at the time, goes to the emergency meeting, which happens the next day, to say, give me £500,000, 10 good men, and this will never happen again. And this is the formation of what was initially known as the Special Operations Squad, becomes the Special Demonstration Squad. He recruits heavily from Special Branch, from officers who have been doing plainclothes work. They're sent undercover with full identities, they're sent undercover to make friends, to get real connections with groups. And we get to a point where a senior police officer brags in one of the later annual reports from the SDS that no public demonstration happens in London without at least overt or covert policing. And significantly, within left-wing groups, you've got undercover officers really at the heart of these groups, at the very heart of them.
Since 1968, over 1,000 democratic campaign groups from anti-apartheid and trade unions to animal rights and climate change groups have all been infiltrated by the Special Demonstration Squad. The squad's existence remained a secret for 46 years until 2014, when it was revealed that 3 Special Demonstration Squad undercover officers had infiltrated the family justice campaign of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered by racists in 1993. One inquiry had already found that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist, but rather than learn their lessons, the police decided to use undercover police officers in an attempt to smear the family's reputation.
It's taken over nearly 21 years since Stephen's been killed, and the fact that we as a family had to go through all this, and still there's more to come out.
Then, when Mark Kennedy was exposed, further allegations against the Special Demonstration Squad were made public. These included the use of extensive undercover operations, weaponizing of sexual relations with women activists, and using the identities of dead children as cover. But instead of swift action, the government called another inquiry.
The picture which emerges about the SDS from this report and from other material in the public domain is of significant failings of judgment, intrusive supervision, and leadership over a sustained period.
But it was to be a secret inquiry. Most of the identities of the 140 undercover police spies were to be hidden, its scope severely limited, and virtually no cross-examination allowed by the lawyers for more than 50 women activists deceived into sexual relations, or the 1,000 democratic groups infiltrated since 1968. A few core participants were given access to the proceedings in evidence. One of these is Tom Fowler, who has watched every day of the inquiry, constantly communicating his findings to the thousands affected.
When I'm watching the undercover officers on screen, you get a real mixture of emotions that's coming out from them. Some are very defiant and bullish, and are angry that they're being asked these questions. The most common answer you get is, I don't recall, I don't remember. I couldn't say, oh, it was 40 years ago. Most of the Special Demonstration Squad officers were male. And for the majority of their history, they were male. At the very beginning, there was a small number of female officers. One of the ones we heard at the first phase of the inquiry was Sandra, who was she was tasked with infiltrating the Women's Liberation Front. These groups were doing things like running crashes, they were holding jumble sales, they were trying to empower women to leave their violent marriages, issues like that, which brought them to the attention of the police as just being unacceptable, criminal, subversive organisations which needed to be smashed.
The Women's Liberation Front was very conscious of the fact that women were receiving an unequal education, as I believe they still do. We wanted people to read and come to public meetings, come to our house for study groups. We were completely open. There was nothing hidden, nothing secret. They were there for the specific purpose of ideological spying in the same way as the Stasi. There was no point in it whatsoever because we're not hiding anything. Everything we do is in the public. There were two at least who came into our house. Sandra, the woman who was spying on the Women's Liberation Front and on the women's movement, had definitely been inside my house because the meetings were held there. And then Dave Robertson obviously came to our home several times, many times. It was a bit of a game for them, I think. And obviously, you only have to read the reports to see that there's nothing in there that is even remotely subversive. They were talking about my childcare arrangements. The more revealing insight into Sandra's thinking was the reports that she wrote, where she talked about women kissing, women showing affection for one another, and seemed to be obsessed with the fact that there were lesbians attending women's liberation conferences. She's written several pages about the way women were dancing together, about the food that was served, about the music that was played, as she put it, to get women in the mood. It was gross. It's so prurient, so nasty, so petty. And to think she was getting paid for doing this. Unbelievable.
Another of the groups that the police considered a danger was the anti-apartheid campaign, who supported Nelson Mandela and his struggle against the racist policies of the South African government.
Campaigners, led by Mr. Peter Hain, urged rugby fans to make a grassroots protest against the Lions' visit to South Africa. They described it as a sellout to apartheid and racism in sport.
The British anti-apartheid movement was the most successful, well-organised and influential of the entire international campaign against apartheid. And the Stop the 70 tour campaign was one that I led. It was a campaign focused specifically on using direct action, non-violent pitch invasions, for example, to stop Springbok rugby, cricket and other sports tours from whites-only teams from apartheid South Africa.
My moral objection to the tour is that it's playing according to the rules of apartheid, of racialism. If the tour was playing against sides selected on a non-racial basis, like happens elsewhere in the world, then I'd be all in favour of it.
I had come up with the idea of non-violently invading the pitch to physically stop the matches and using other forms of direct action to stop the team going about its normal activity. I announced this to the press. There was no secret, subversive, criminal enterprise involved here. It was a part of the anti-apartheid struggle inspired by Nelson Mandela from his prison in Robben Island. So the idea that we could be equated with terrorism or Moscow-orientated subversion because this was the middle of the Cold War was preposterous. I knew my telephone was tapped. and I suspected other forms of surveillance. But I had no idea of the sheer extent of this undercover police activity. In virtually every meeting I ever went to, private or public, in my parents' living room or in a town hall, there was a police undercover officer present. Why were they not targeting the South African Security Service that bombed Nelson Mandela's London headquarters? Why were they not bringing to justice those South African agents who attacked the anti-apartheid movement's headquarters, or who murdered in 1970 a journalist in London who was about to expose their nefarious activities? This was political policing. They were targeting anti-apartheid forces, not the forces of apartheid, bombing and killing and fire attacking anti-apartheid organizations.
In order to infiltrate these democratic organizations, the police developed various tactics, but the one that has attracted some of the worst criticism is police officers deliberately starting relationships with female activists in order to gain information.
My name's Madeline. I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party who basically were campaigning for a better world, a socialist world, a world free from poverty, exploitation, war, and we were hoping to build a mass movement to bring about this change.
Madeline, not her real name, was the first woman who had a sexual relationship with an undercover police officer to give evidence at the inquiry. His cover name was Vince Miller.
Back in the late 70s, it was actually a really dark and scary time. The National Front had started to grow. You know, there was a crisis, there was growing unemployment, there was a lot of anti-immigrant hatred being whipped up, which the National Front took advantage of. They basically declared a race war. You know, there was, I think there were something like 31 deaths, or murders, should I say, of black and Asian people by the far right. You know, we know, you know, where it goes, that they were Nazis, really. You know, the Socialist Workers' Party had 18 undercover officers, you know, spying on us. They knew what the far right were doing, and they allowed it to happen. The police allowed it to happen. We suspect that there was a lot of sympathy within the police. There seemed to be a lot of sympathy within the government, who were increasingly, you know, making kind of anti-immigrant statements anyway. Absolutely no justification for infiltrating us, and yeah, they should have been monitoring them.
When we see the development of the Special Demonstration Squad in the 1970s, I think the National Front, like if you were looking at it totally dispassionately and you said, oh, it's about public order, it's about subversion, you'd see the rise of the National Front and you go, well, there you go, there's a perfect target for you. Yet they weren't targeted at all. Because part of it was all about fighting social attitudes. And what the National Front represented was a return to the kind of attitudes, the continuation of the kind of attitudes that the Special Demonstration Squad officers themselves held. That actually Britain was being ruined by foreigners. That if we could just get rid of the ethnic minorities, Britain would be a better place.
I can first remember Vince Miller because he joined, I think his deployment started towards the end of 76, beginning of 77. He made contact with the Socialist Worker weekly sales and actually saw them being confronted by the National Front, and then spoke to the sellers and said, you know, I'm here if you need any help, just give us a buzz, kind of thing, and I'll come down and help. So there was a bit of a buzz about somebody from the street coming in and offering. It was obviously an anti-fascist, as we thought. And yeah, he then embedded himself for the next 3 years, became completely enmeshed in our political lives and our social lives, very much so in our social lives. You know, we now know that it was a tactic to get all the contact details, find out where everyone lived, visit their houses. I think he said he visited about 3/4 of people's houses, who was Vince Miller. You know, we don't know who he is. Well, we know the kind of the fake persona, the phantom Vince Miller. We don't know who HN 354 is.
Madeleine had forgotten all about her relationship with Vince Miller back in 1979, until an inquiry official knocked on her door in February 2020, and she learned that he was, in fact, a police officer.
I suppose because I was prepared to be cross-examined and to give my testimony, and then immediately he was then cross-examined, and I do feel that they were the questions were a lot more penetrating. You can't actually get the sense from the transcript as how tense it actually was in the room. There were lots of pauses where he was desperately trying to think on his feet and how to get out of this situation. His body language was really revealing. He was very red, looking really uncomfortable. At one point he looked like he was going to cry. He was kind of sinking under the chair, looking, really uncomfortable. He sought to minimise what had happened by saying he had 4 one-night stands, alcohol was involved, and I saw in his statement originally that he had claimed that I had unexpectedly come onto him and invited him to my bedroom at a party at my house, which is absolutely, totally untrue, because we were in a party in Ilford hours earlier when he pulled me onto his lap. And so I think that he's trying to use alcohol. I felt when I read that statement that he was implying that I was some kind of drunken woman looking for a random man to have sex with. As it was, I'd known him for 3 years, considered him as a friend, really liked him, thought he was a lovely, really lovely guy. Absolutely had no idea that he was a police officer, undercover police officer. I did get asked by in the cross-examination how I would have felt at the time, and had I known that he'd been an undercover police officer at the time, it would have had a devastating effect on me, and I would have regarded it as rape. He was wearing a mask. I didn't know who he was. I wouldn't have consented to have sex with this man, and so in that sense, it's non-consensual. How can you have, it's state-sanctioned rape.
Good morning, Mr. Catterton. Glad you could make it. This is all the literature you will require, an application form and pay scales.
A career in the Metropolitan Police starts with this application form. The recruits live at the Peel Centre while they learn the basics of police work and something about the way society works.
As well as targeting women, undercover officers were developing other standard covert techniques. From 1974 onwards, one of their first tasks before heading out into the field was to acquire a new identity.
From this moment, these recruits are constables of the Crown in the Metropolitan Police.
I was an undercover police officer. When I was deployed undercover, I used predominantly the name Peter Black. I was given a different name that I actually haven't revealed anywhere at all. And the reason for that is I was given the identity of a dead child.
Peter Francis worked undercover for the SDS for 4 years, but was pulled out prematurely and unwillingly in 1997. He had developed real sympathy for the anti-racist protesters and a hatred of police violence. Unable to adjust to normal police life, a few years later, he turned whistleblower.
I was officially sanctioned to resurrect somebody who died. The Home Office then provided me with a passport of a dead child that they knew that was dead within the system. So this is all state sanctioned. When I first joined them, I wasn't aware of what the practices were, what you did to be an undercover officer. So when I was first told that I had to take on the identity of a dead child, it sort of left me with a bit of sort of a question mark about the morality side of doing this, and actually left me quite uncomfortable about doing it. Yet here, somehow or other, I was actually, for want of a better word, resurrecting the identity of somebody who had actually died. I actually had a child of my own, not of a dissimilar age from the actual child that I was resurrecting again. So I had some moral qualms about it, which I actually brought to the head of the management. It was questioning, what we're doing, why are we doing this? And it was explained to me that operationally it was necessary to do this because it allows an additional layer of cover. I then felt very, very uncomfortable with my activists every single year celebrating my birthday of that dead child, because I knew every single year, myself now as a parent of a child, if my child had passed away, that would be a very, very special day for me, always remembering when they were born and when they died. But me then actually being happy and sort of celebrating this person's birthday when I actually knew he was dead actually once again left me sort of uncomfortable, I think is the best way of describing it, which later on added to a multitude of build-up problems that I myself had mental health-wise afterwards. It's something I had to deal with, wasn't comfortable, and I should never really have gone against my better instincts, even at the beginning of it.
Distraught families of the dead children are now giving evidence against this police tactic at the inquiry. Heather Williams QC, representing 5 families, told the inquiry,
"Our clients seek answers from this inquiry to the most fundamental issues regarding this callous misuse of their loved ones' identities. We believe that the conclusion must inevitably be that there was no clear rationale, no sufficient justification, and no necessity for this repulsive practice."
Stop! Release action now! Release action, stay!
In the early 1980s, one of the officers sent to infiltrate the animal rights movement became one of the most notorious spy cops, Bob Robinson, real name Bob Lambert.
1984, I met Bob. I'd been involved in animal rights for probably about 3 or 4 years by then. Started seeing him everywhere. He was turning up at meetings. He's kind of quite smiley and easygoing, laid back. That's why so many activists sort of trusted him and, would call him a friend. As you probably find with the story with all of them, but as we know, kind of Bob was the trailblazer, the one who sort of started it all, is they all had, and so did Bob, an old van. And he offered to lift home. And now know that this is the way they find out where people live. And the person they're kind of targeting, the woman, because it always seems to be women, it doesn't seem to be the other way around, would be the last one to be dropped off. Invited him in once, and that's how our relationship started. Bob was there throughout the pregnancy. He went to appointments with me. He came to the scan with me. And he was there when I went into labour. And being my first child, I was in labour for 14 and a half, 15 hours. And he was there throughout that. And he held our son as soon as he was born. I wasn't to find out until 2012 that in fact he had a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, son and a daughter.
Years later, whistleblower spy cop Peter Francis was trained for undercover operations by Bob Lambert, who had been promoted to manage and train new recruits within the Special Demonstration Squad, where Lambert was hailed as a hero.
When I was deployed, we were allowed to do anything to keep in role. So my role was a single person, and I was provided a flat to be a single person there. So if in the event your persona, it was necessary to engage in sexual activity for the purpose that you deemed to have purposes for cover, you were allowed to do that. It was also stressed, if you have sex, make sure you use a condom. And the irony is, the officer who told me that, Bob Lambert, he failed actually to mention to me that he actually had a child when he was out there. He talked about somebody else having a child, but not himself. There's give or take 110 SDS officers, and I'd be very, very surprised if there's only one SDS child out there.
When it was first revealed that undercover officers had been sleeping with the women they were spying on, they claimed that relationships were an inevitable result of people being close to each other. However, in the SDS Tradecraft Manual, there is a whole section on tactics the officer can use when extricating themselves from a relationship. It says that they should be fleeting and disastrous.
He didn't leave until our son was 2. He was engineering arguments. And having spoken to other women, that's what they do. They always have a kind of mental instability about them, something in their past that makes them very fragile. And with Bob, it was that his mum had died when he was a child. She died in her 30s of cancer. And, he even talked to my mum about this sort of kind of trauma. And this is when he used to sort of say he needed some space, or he needed to, and I kind of thought it all went back to that. He had issues around kind of abandonment because, his mum had died. I mean, I'm later to find out that his mum's a fit and healthy 90-year-old. I assumed he was probably sleeping with other women. I now know that he had, including me, and 3 other. I think his bosses must have known. I can't see how they couldn't have known. And then one day he came home and he said that he was going to have to leave. He said that he was always obsessed with there being infiltrators in the group. He was always telling people what to watch out for, things like that. So anyway, he said he was going to have to go because there had been, he said people were being arrested. He said they were after him. And I said, well, I haven't, why would it sort of affect me? And he said, oh, well, it will do, and it could do, and I don't want to risk that and everything. And he'd always said that he had friends, anarchists in Spain, that he knew that could help him. And then he left. I remember watching him walk down the path, got in his van, and that's the last I saw of him.
At the end of his time in the field, Bob Lambert went on to train other officers. His experiences are then recorded in what is known as the Tradecraft Manual. Tellingly, it reveals the Special Demonstration Squad's attitude to their targets, who are exclusively single-issue or left-wing groups.
Undercover police officers have created their own slang, which is noticeable within their reports, but is particularly noticeable within the Tradecraft Manual. They refer to themselves as the Hairies because they grew out their hair, they grew out their beards to make themselves more unkempt looking because they felt it would make it easier to infiltrate left-wing groups. They refer to the people they're infiltrating as the Wearies, as it made them weary to talk to these people. They have to be really told not to be offensive. Don't say anything sexist. Don't say anything racist. I mean, this is repeated within the Tradecraft Manual because it's obviously a problem that the kind of people who become Special Demonstration Squad officers were likely to hold sexist and racist attitudes. And in fact, when we see from their reports, they very much did. They obviously did not like the people they were infiltrating. They found them at the very least irritating, if not hateful in some cases. One of the things that's said in the Tradecraft Manual is you need to hold back your disdain for the people you're infiltrating. Hold back your disgust. that some, that this idea that you wouldn't be able to cope with dealing with these people unless you're really made of strong stuff, because they're so unlikable.
In the heavily redacted version released, areas of operation are known as bandit country. Targets are known as wearies. Anarchists are called crusties. The files state, the crusty lifestyle in particular is really unpleasant. You will be expected to eat food you wouldn't put in your own bin, drink tea from cups, which appear to have grown their own beards, and sit on furniture which is alive.
The safe house atmosphere was one of bawdy, sexist, misogynist humour. That things like, I bet he made her bite the blanket last night, was the kind of things that they were saying to each other. That it was openly known that certain officers were sexually predatory and was considered very amusing. Things like, good on you, mate, go for it, enjoy yourself, were talked about. And I think even from the earliest officers who denied it, but it was clear that they'd in their reports, they talk about going for drinks with women. Remember, all these officers are married. You had to be married in order to be in the unit.
The undercover police didn't just infiltrate left-wing political groups, they also targeted anti-racism and anti-Nazi campaigns.
Really, there was no anti-racist, anti-fascist demonstration in London from September 1993 to September 1997 that I can recall that I wasn't involved in. So every single time political activists went on the streets, I was there with them. Then within that role, people who were involved in those campaigns I reported back on. That was my main remit that I was employed.
Peter Francis' sympathy for anti-racist activists grew, as did his dislike of the police, as he witnessed their violent attacks on legitimate protesters.
I did actually have some qualms even when I was deployed. There's one specific example. I was outside Kennington Police Station, and some officers from Kennington Police Station that been involved in an arrest that resulted in the death of Brian Douglas, who was involved in a struggle with the police. And the family, with me present there and other demonstrators, were outside the police station calling for regress, that this was sort of dealt with, properly investigated. And I felt at the time that me being on that actual event was wrong. I actually felt that the family were fully justified in being outside the police station, calling, that they wanted this to be investigated properly, and I felt very uncomfortable by being at that police station. And I think the thing that struck me the most with the demonstration is how restrained the family were. And they were amazingly restrained, and the mother of Brian Douglas, she actually called for the demonstrators to make sure they were calm and stayed calm and all this stuff. And me, myself, I was trying to equate then what I would personally have felt like if somebody just killed my son.
I just want peace and tranquility. Let's go on to the park and end this demonstration in peace.
I forecasted beforehand that it was extremely volatile, that it may very lead in disorder. I was asked, well, what can we do? And I had a very brief answer. I'm not sure it actually went back exactly the way I gave it the SDS, is I just said, well, basically stop killing black people.
The final straw for Peter Francis came when he was ordered to infiltrate the Stephen Lawrence family to gather anything he could that might undermine the family's fight for justice.
I think it's a police-state thing. They wish to know what society is doing. It's been described in the media that the unit felt that we may have lost our moral compass, and I felt that is probably a bit more severe than that. I believe we didn't have a moral compass.
In 2013, Francis went public and told the press how he had secretly gathered information on the Stephen Lawrence campaign. His aim was to force the police to investigate the racist murder properly. A few months later, Mark Kennedy was revealed to be an undercover officer. The police tried to say that he was just one bad apple, but Peter Francis revealed that he was part of a unit called the Special Demonstration Squad. At that point, the women whose partners had abandoned them years earlier started putting two and two together. They came together to fight back and get answers to their many questions.
From the very beginning, it was important to us that this wasn't just about a rogue officer. So when we started the case, there were 8 of us, and it was 8 women who had had relationships with 5 different officers over a period of time spanning 30 years. So for us, it was very clear from the beginning. And when we met and we started to talk about the relationships, it very quickly emerged that there were patterns. There were ways of manipulating our emotions that we could see repeating across the different relationships. So for us, it was very clear from very early on that this was something systemic. This was something they were trained to do. This felt like a tactic.
All these undercovers shared similarities, and we needed to start documenting that. We needed to start understanding, as part of our healing, just how things had happened, how they'd achieved what they had done, and how we can protect ourselves in the future. So a few of us started writing down, making notes. Well, you know, they drove cars, they were very skilled drivers, they had houses by themselves that looked unlived in. Started building up this profile. And I think it was 2013 that the Undercover Research Group came together by a number of people, including myself, who recognized these patterns and wanted to keep pushing at that door that was slowly opening.
Activist and McLibel campaigner Helen Steele had a relationship with a man she knew as John Barker. When he disappeared, she tracked him down for over a decade to discover that he was a spy cop called John Dines. There was also growing suspicion about a former member of the Reclaim the Streets group known as Jim Sutton. He had a child with an activist called Rosa, then vanished. In reality, he was the spy cop, Jim Boyling. One bizarre discovery concerns the spy cop Andy Coles, known as Andy Davey, who had a relationship with Jessica.
It was down to his brother, Reverend Richard Coles, and his autobiography, where he states that his brother was undercover during the 1990s. And, you know, that little bit of information was then passed on to the Undercover Research Group. You know, one of the people that stood out was Andy Davey. And so, like, a picture was sent round, and yes, he was identified as Andy Coles.
Andy Coles is currently a Conservative councillor in Peterborough. So Jessica makes regular visits there to warn people about his past.
I've come up to Peterborough probably 15 or 20 times to put leaflets around sort of through the doors of all the houses in his ward, just to tell people what he did. And basically, you know, the fact that he's still a Conservative councillor, you know, when people find out about what he did, you know, they're shocked that he can still be a councillor. It just explains about what he did, about him being an abuser of women, violator of human rights, and he's lying to Peterborough about his role as an undercover officer. When I was 19, and the time that I met Andy, my driving sort of passion at that time was animals. I suppose at that age it's just to make the world a better place for people and animals. And I can't even remember sort of when I met him. It's just that he would be around like the groups, or he would just be, you know, a meeting. Probably the first time I was really sort of kind of noticed him was literally when he came round our house. He just knocked on the door. It was late in the evening, which was a bit strange, and so, you know, you welcome people in. It was only a bit later when one of the other people that I lived with said, you know, well, you know, you invited him round. And I said, no, I didn't, I thought you did. And it sort of went around the whole house, and nobody had invited him, so he'd invited himself. Sort of the next thing is sat down watching TV together. I turned to him and he just like sort of lunged and just kissed me, and like he said nothing, you know, had no sort of indication or anything. That's just what he did. And I just remember sort of being like so taken aback, you know, that had never happened to me before. And it's the horrible sort of situation of like, oh my God, what do I do? And it was just really sort of very uncomfortable. And I don't know, I think I was so completely embarrassed by it. And just, I really didn't know what to do. And sort of somehow, I don't really know kind of how, I mean, you know, we ended up like in a relationship together. I just think sometimes it feels as though it was actually less embarrassing to just go along with it. You know, he had all the power. When I was a teenager, he knew exactly what he was doing. You know, he was 32, which I didn't, you know, I thought he was sort of in his like 12 or 24, but he was 32 and, you know, a police officer, and he deceived me into a sexual relationship. And it's all about the power, and, you know, where he's got the public trust and the situation that he's in as a counsellor, you know, he has that power over other people, and I can't deal with the thoughts that he's going to do it again.
Despite the Met Police upholding Jessica's complaints against Coles, he was still allowed to become a Deputy Police Commissioner and a Conservative councillor. Andy Coles has denied Jessica's allegations, describing them as lurid. But when we offered him the chance to put his side of the story, we got no reply. We did, however, find this recording.
I think you just have to reflect on what I've experienced since 2017. The sort of effects that has been to me and to my family. I don't want to go into any great detail because I tend not to want to share that sort of thing publicly. But I really hope that people understand that abuse does happen towards male counsellors, and it is pretty devastating when you receive it. It's quite hard to handle sometimes, and I'm even getting it today, which is just utterly unacceptable.
One of the allegations against the spy cops is that they were urging activists to perform illegal acts, something that has always been denied.
As regards that, you know, they weren't supposed to be agents provocateurs, you know, again, that's a nonsense. Andy, you know, he organised a raid on a battery farm to rescue chickens, and used his van. He drove everybody there, and, you know, drove us and the chickens away.
Controversy also surrounds Bob Lambert. In 2012, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas used parliamentary privilege to quote the testimony of an activist who claimed to know him. The activist quoted talked about Bob Lambert's direct involvement in animal rights activities against the fur trade.
Now, the latest allegations concerning Bob Lambert would beg the question: has another undercover police officer crossed the line into acting as an agent provocateur? And how many other police spies have been encouraging protesters to commit crimes?
The group discovered that Bob Lambert had become a lecturer in terrorism studies at the University of St Andrews and a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University's John Greaves Centre for Policing. They were keen to ask him some questions.
Bob, we'd like to talk to you about your infiltration of London Greenpeace and your abuse of the female campaigners. What are you ashamed of?
Although they had tracked down Lambert, they hadn't managed to find Jackie to tell her who the father of her child really was. For 25 years, Jackie didn't know the truth about the man who walked out of her life until he was named in Parliament.
To come home from work, got home about 4 o'clock, June, so it was sunny. Went outside with the paper. I sat outside to read it, and I just was flicking the pages, and then there was a picture of him in the 80s, because what had happened the day before is Caroline Lucas, MP, had named him using parliamentary privilege. I just saw this picture, and that was it. That was like the earthquake, and the shaking, and obviously I went on, Googled it, and I saw pages of it come up, and I saw what he looked like now. I saw that he was an academic at St Andrews University, and he had some YouTube lectures on Islamophobia, and I watched those, and I knew straight away that, you know, because his mannerisms, but once I saw him talking the way he talks, and said his mannerisms, you know, I could see our son in him, and you know, I knew I had the right person. I waited to the first possible moment, almost on the sort of strike of about 9 o'clock, and I rang St Andrews University, and he said, "Hello Jackie, it's Bob." And that's the first time I'd heard his voice in 24 years. So our son was 26 by then. It was a very, very emotional phone call. He obviously asked how our son was, and he said that he wanted to see him, and we exchanged email. We both kind of laid out more or less our life stories, what had happened to us in the meantime. And we eventually met up in the August. And I get criticised for that, but while my son wants to see him and while they have a relationship, I think even if they didn't, he's kind of linked to me. He's linked to me at a very kind of primal DNA. He's my first child's father, and we will share grandchildren together. I don't want to make it difficult for our son.
While Lambert himself didn't deny being the father of Jackie's son, the police authorities were unwilling to accept any responsibility.
They kind of ignored us for a couple of years. They just kind of sort of ignored it because they were still this policy of neither confirm nor deny, which was, you know, despite the fact I had 6 foot of DNA walking around, they were still denying Bob was a cop.
But by coming together and making what had happened to them public, and outing the activities of the spy cops at press conferences, the women tried to force a response from the police.
The overall theme was delay this as much as possible, avoid disclosure at any cost. And what at any cost actually meant in practice was, when it comes to it, if we can't delay this any longer, admit what we're being accused of so that there is no case. So with our civil claim, they tried to get it kicked out. The first communications that we had from them were, we're not responding to your claim and you cannot possibly succeed. And they were applications to strike the claim out. And when that ceased to work, it then went to mediation, and 7 out of the 8 women settled.
The Metropolitan Police Service has recently settled 7 claims arising out of the totally unacceptable behaviour of a number of undercover police officers working for the now disbanded Special Demonstration Squad. Thanks in large part to the courage and tenacity of these women in bringing these matters to light, it has become apparent that some officers, acting undercover while seeking to infiltrate protest groups, entered into long-term intimate sexual relationships with women, which were abusive, deceitful, manipulative and wrong. I acknowledge that these relationships were a violation of the women's human rights, an abuse of police power and caused significant trauma. I unreservedly apologise on behalf of the Metropolitan Police Service. The Metropolitan Police recognises that this should never happen again.
In their apology, the police still tried to distance themselves from the behaviour of their officers, despite the fact that everything had been known about and had been sanctioned. They also claimed that the behaviour had only come to light due to the courage and tenacity of the women, when in fact they had thousands of official documents that gave detailed day-to-day accounts of what had gone on for over 40 years.
The picture which emerges about the SDS from this report and from other material in the public domain is of significant failings of judgment, intrusive supervision and leadership over a sustained period.
When Theresa May announced an inquiry in 2015, The hope was that the women would finally get full disclosure. But having been announced, the inquiry didn't start for another 5 years, and it was anything but high profile.
It was called in 2015. It didn't get started until 2020. Essentially, the police had dragged it out with anonymity orders, judicial reviews, and doing everything they possibly could to not cooperate with the inquiry.
I was very reluctant to get on the inquiry because most inquiries are either cover-ups or too late. I don't place much faith in British inquiries because they're the traditional way the British state deals with problems they don't like that have cropped up. Let's call an inquiry and long grass. We'll see how long it lasts. By the time the report comes out, whatever the judge says, most of my generation probably will be dead.
They're putting everything back into the long grass until everybody's dead and nobody cares, or they are trying to justify the spying on completely innocent people, because it wasn't just the people who you've seen come before the inquiry so far. It looks like thousands of people were spied on, and I despair of the entire process, because they're not making, they're giving anonymity on one side. They're not challenging these cops at all, and yet we are being turned inside out. One of the things that sickens me is that women are having to get up and talk about very intimate relationships that they had in front of an old white man who himself shows signs of being institutionally sexist in the way that he spoke to my QC by shouting at her, "I'm not here to answer your questions."
For many of the women, the first they knew that a man they had a relationship with had been a police officer came decades later, when a member of the inquiry team knocked on their door to ask if they would be willing to be a witness.
I was glad that I came forward, because if I hadn't been prepared to be cross-examined, only Vince Miller's testimony would have been heard, and his version would have been heard, which, as we know, is untrue. So I had to kind of find all my courage, as it were. I think, the whole inquiry thing has been really stressful. They contacted me fairly late in the process. They'd had my name for 2 years, but nobody contacted me. This whole secrecy is basically keeping the lid on the extent of this scandal, and it's stopping lots of people kind of becoming involved. I'm sure that there are hundreds of people out there that have been affected that don't know. So you have to kind of question, why is it taking so long? Why is there so much privacy? Why are there all the redactions?
We might get who some of the bosses were. So, like we know, Jim Boylan, Bob was his boss, and we might end up finding out, and you may already know, Mark Kennedy's sort of thing. But it's not going to get up to the sort of level. It's just not. It's it's the same with the child abuse inquiry, and it's not. And the people at the kind of the politicians at that kind of level that must have authorised this, they may be dead. Otherwise, they're very old. If there is somebody that's kind of implicated, who's very, very establishment, they just keep it going until he dies. I'm assuming it's a he. It's almost certainly going to be a he.
Whilst 7 of the women accepted the compensation they were offered, Kate Wilson, who had been using the name Lily, refused it, and in 2011 issued a civil claim for damages under the Human Rights Act.
At least 6 people that I knew and worked with, and some of whom I considered friends, were actually undercover police officers. And this year, we found this GPS tracker stuck under my car. And finding the GPS tracker was a bit of a wake-up call. They've basically been targeting me for the last 17 years. I think it's important that people know that this stuff is happening, but I think it's also important to say that this stuff happened to us because we were doing something right. Yeah, like, don't stop, don't be scared by what we're saying, be aware. When I didn't settle, the next thing that they did was basically say, we will not be offering a defence. We accept everything in the claim, but we will be contesting damages. And what that meant was that the case would become about whether what they did caused any damage. And that was very deeply offensive to me, because what they were basically saying was, yes, we did all this stuff, but we don't think it was a big deal. We don't think it hurt you at all, and we're going to take you to court over that. I had to do an interview with a psychiatrist employed by them about the damage that had been done, and it was awful. It is absolutely the worst time of my life, was having to go through this detailed examination when all we wanted was answers. And even when they went to mediation, the one thing that they would never ever contemplate was giving us our files. And they have never, in the it's 12 years now since Mark was uncovered, they have never voluntarily handed over files to the women who they deceived into these relationships. And there are 27 women involved in the public inquiry right now, and the police have not given them anything. And the inquiry has not really given us anything yet either. I am the only woman who has been given answers, and that is because it was ordered by the Investigatory Powers Tribunal that the police hand over.
In 2010, an activist known as Lisa discovered the truth about her long-term partner, fellow environmentalist Mark Stone. He was actually Mark Kennedy, an undercover policeman spying on their movement for 7 years. One of the women, Kate Wilson, was able to take the police to court for breaches of her human rights. Kate argued the officers deceiving women weren't the only bad apples. The abuse was systemic and went right up the chain. Kate argued that senior officers knew about it and were complicit, that these operations against political dissent were unlawful and a violation of her human rights. The court agreed. In September 2021, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, the IPT, ruled that the police had violated 5 articles of the Human Rights Act.
For me, it was massive, because what we actually won at the end was so much more than what we'd even set out to win at the beginning, because the Spy Cops story just kept getting bigger and kept getting bigger. So I went into this case coming out of a very personal betrayal, where my ex-partner and close friend had turned out to be somebody who never existed. And by the time we got to court, 11 years later, the actual trial was about human rights. It was about systemic issues of sexism within the Metropolitan Police. It was about the right to protest, and it was about whether it was lawful to send these police officers into social movements at all. And so, yes, to look back from that day in court at where we'd started, it was just massive what we won. They basically found that Mark Kennedy's operation was unlawful and unnecessary in a democratic society. And the evidence that came out showed that he had been sent in on a 7-year fishing expedition to gather intelligence on any and all people involved in any and all kinds of protest. There was no criminal investigation linked to it. It was quite simply gather all the intelligence that you can on these people, and all the intelligence that you can specifically focused on people's relationships, people's health, people's private lives. And it was just building up information. And there were some quite interesting moments in the documents where you could see that they were almost saying, these protests or these individuals might be involved in crime, but actually what we're interested in is these individuals because they have ideas, and they have ideas that could influence people. And there was a very kind of clear ideological direction to it, and the police just should not be doing that kind of thing in a democratic society. You shouldn't have secret police officers manipulating protest groups. Like, that's dangerous for everybody. I do consider that the responsibility and participation in what happened to me went far wider than Mark. I would never consider it justice for Mark to be brought to justice about what happened and nobody else. For me, there were quite clearly other people taking part at all stages in the process. So in that sense, yes, I wasn't raped by Mark alone in that sense.
If the police weren't collecting information to stop crime, then this raises the question, who are they collecting this information for?
Bob was at quite a junior level. It's his first undercover job, so he had layers of management above him. And this would have been authorised at the highest level.
I knew that my intelligence was going up through the special branch, up to commander special branch level, and just occasionally if we'd done a good report on something, say we forecasted very accurately some public order, disorder situation or some intelligence about somebody, very occasionally you'd be told by the senior manager, this went to the commissioner directly. Me personally, I was never aware. I was once told that my intelligence went over to the Home Office. I was told about a specific case that the intelligence I reported back on went over to the Home Office, but I've got to say that was an extremely rare example, and predominantly at the time I was just told it was in the Metropolitan Police Service.
Oh, we went right to the government, the top of government. Prime Ministers knew. Mark Kennedy said, Tony Blair was receiving some of his reports. There's evidence coming out in the inquiry that also point to Prime Ministers knowing. Home Secretaries certainly knew. So, and that's Labour and Tory.
It's repeatedly said in Mark Kennedy's authorisations that the main thing that they're worried about is the embarrassment to Her Majesty's government if it were ever found out. That's, it's not like the safety of the officer if we ever found out that he was an undercover police officer. It's the embarrassment to the government if it was ever found out that they were sending people in to spy on political groups.
I think it's an absolutely huge scandal. We don't know the half of it. We really don't. Who was sanctioning this behaviour? Why were they trying to get this information? We know it was on the left. We know it's political policing. And it seems apparent that it was coming from government, from the Home Office, security services were involved. It seems as though there was a kind of, that the SDS were gathering information at the behest of the security services.
They were doing a lot of the grunt work for MI5. And most of the information and the documents that we have were actually kept by MI5 and not by the police. So there is a kind of ideological, it was started during the Cold War, and it was very much, stop any and all kinds of left-wing ideology from taking root in our society.
What we were doing as a tactic, I would regard more in common with the Stasi than more in common of what the British think the Bobby and police officers should be doing. We were the home of democracy. We are actually the home of democracy. Our democracy has been copied in several places across the world, and hopefully they're not copying this tactic against their political activists or demonstrators that we did there.
I strongly believe that this undercover policing over these decades was firmly on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of the anti-apartheid battle, siding with the apartheid forces, not with Nelson Mandela's worldwide campaign for freedom, on the wrong side of the anti-racist battle, infiltrating the Stephen Lawrence campaign rather than catching his murderers, on the wrong side of women's rights, infiltrating women's rights groups in the early 1970s rather than advancing the cause of women's equality, on the wrong side of the climate change emergency by targeting environmental activists rather than those responsible for polluting and spoiling our planet. At every point, the undercover policing can be judged as falling on the wrong side. What it has done is undermine the fabric of democracy, because it's discriminatory. It is targeting genuine people fighting for civil rights, fighting against racism, in my case, campaigning against apartheid. What is revealed by this undercover policing is that it is one-sided, and it is focused on people who want to bring about change, to bring about a more just, equal society in which civil rights are protected.
Democracy isn't just voting once every 4 years or every 5 years or whatever. It's about the ability of members of the public to formulate and express themselves politically in a way in which allows other people to join with them and change public attitudes by discussion and demonstration. That was all suppressed and repressed as hard as the state possibly could manage. Because even though this undercover policing inquiry obviously is looking at the covert tactics that were used, but we shouldn't forget the overt policing that was also taking place. When you look at protests by these groups in the 70s, the levels of policing surrounding their demonstrations, the intimidation, the violence, it's all there for us all to see. And when you put them together with the covert policing that's taking place, we're talking about a really dystopian country that we're living in.
Having been found out, the government have now imposed legislation that makes it much harder to protest. People can now be jailed for years for standing up for what they believe in. And with the proliferation of the internet, there is now not so much need to physically infiltrate the groups that the government is worried about. The government has also passed laws to legalize what the spy cops did. These laws can be used to make undercover police officers immune from prosecution if they break the law.
One has to accept that the British state and its democratic structures have deteriorated and degenerated over the years. What happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s was awful. It was the beginning. And that has to be, now it is being done legally. It's being done legally. There are no huge protests. So the notion that those days were bad, but we've got over that period now. Now we're living in democratic time. That is what needs to be criticized and attacked. Things are much worse today than they were then.
So is there any evidence that this kind of political policing by the state still goes on today? And if it does, how would we recognize it?
I think undercover policing and the scandal of undercover policing is ongoing. Who is under surveillance now? Which groups are under surveillance now?
The courts have found it was unnecessary in a democratic society to do what they were doing. The police and the state thought it was necessary, and they still do think it's necessary. They are still trying to claim that Extinction Rebellion are a terrorist organisation. And then when the public find out that they're doing that, they go, oh no, that was a mistake. That should never have gone in the manual. They do this stuff in secret, and they do it because the government and the state exist to protect the rich. You know, and they have immense discretionary powers which they use to ideological ends to protect property and to protect the rich.